Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Road to Success, Hispanic Heritage Month, where we talk about reaching out to Hispanic communities within the state of Florida.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kimberly McDonough. I'm the co-chair of the Social Responsibility Committee.
And I'm Dr. Nicholas Nelson Godert, chair of the Florida PTA Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Committee.
PTA mission statement. Every child, one voice. PTA's mission is to make every child's potential a reality by engaging and empowering families and communities to advocate for all children.
And in advocating for all children, that includes the Hispanic children of Florida. So what we'll do in this discussion is talk about the Hispanic identity, as well as some methods to reach out to Hispanic communities within the state. And in talking about Hispanic identity, we'll talk about the specific terms that can be used in referring to this group that's ever expanding in our state. First, we have the idea that Hispanic identity is actually an ethnicity, and it's not a race. Where if we look at the term ethnicity, we see that it's an identity that's based on inherited cultural characteristics, such as language, religion, value sets, diet, and traditions. Some examples include Hispanic, but also Cajun, Han Chinese, Irish American, German American, a variety of different groups with a variety of different cultural characteristics. If we put this in contrast and compare it with race, we see that race would be a social construct that's based on inherited physical characteristics. Some examples include white, black, Asian, American, Indian. So the reason why we wanted to include this is that you can be Hispanic and you can be of any race. It can be white Hispanic, it can be Asian Hispanic, it can be Black Hispanic. There's a wide variety of different racial groups within the overall umbrella of Hispanic. In fact, we see that the term Hispanic itself first appeared in the 1970 census. And the original criteria included Spanish speakers, people belonging to a household where Spanish was spoken, people with Spanish heritage by birth location, as well as those who self-identify with Latin America, excluding Brazil, excluding Haiti, excluding French Guiana. But we see that this term was malleable and expanded to include even more groups, where we see that the US government expanded usage of the term as well as academia since that time. So we see that from the 90s onward, that US Department of Transportation expanded the idea of Hispanic to include those of Spanish or Portuguese culture, US Business Administration as well, including Spain, Portugal, and the Iberian Peninsula. So not just limited to Latin America, which the term originally included. And we see the term expand, the concept expand even more by the inclusion of the term Latino. So of course, in your daily speech, in terms of talking about different groups, you've come across Latino, and you might wonder, what's the difference between Hispanic and Latino? Well, we first see the term Latino used in 1997 by the US government, but the US government actually uses them interchangeably. So it uses them the same to refer to the same set of people within the United States. However, we see that academic usage splits the terms Hispanic and Latino to an extent, where we see Latino would be having roots in Latin America, whereas Hispanic, according to academic work, would refer to having roots in the Spanish-speaking regions of the Americas. And we see that Latino is more commonly used on the West Coast of the US, and Hispanic is used more commonly on the East Coast. So this probably has gotten even more confusing in terms of the specific terms that should be used. So let's dive into it even more by asking people who would be self-identified as either Latino or Hispanic, which terms should be used. And we see that, well, first, initially we see that Latinx is one term that is gaining more attention over the past few years, especially the past 5 years. And we see that the majority of those who would identify as Hispanic or Latino do not necessarily resonate with the term Latinx. So it's a majority who identify with other terms. In fact, going into a bit more detail, we see that other, say, pan-ethnic terms or uh, other terms such as Hispanic or Latino would be preferred to Latinx. In fact, we see that the majority prefer the term Hispanic. So throughout today's discussion, I will predominantly use the term Hispanic, though a sizable percentage do prefer Latino. So as a default, I would use the term Hispanic, but people are different, communities are different. If someone tells you that they prefer Latino, then use Latino. Respect people's wishes and their ways of defining themselves. And I actually did a poll of my students who are majority Hispanic, and I wanted to see whether the term Latinx was gaining traction among the group, because some of the research discussed suggested that people who were college age or in their 20s might be gravitating towards Latinx. And at least according to my students, that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. So I would use the term Hispanic as the default, but I would wait to see if anyone had a different term that they would prefer. Would that does that seem like a something that can be done, or something that could be a useful, could say, rule of thumb, Kimberly?
Absolutely. I think it's important to help find out what people would like to be identified as, or whichever term they would like or feel comfortable for us to use when we're talking about them, because I mean, it makes them feel comfortable, right? We want to make sure that we are selecting whatever it feels the most comfortable to them and whatever they want to be identified as.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's all about respect and asking people about their own experiences and opinions.
Absolutely.
So in asking people about opinions, we see that the majority of Hispanic Americans actually have no strong preference between Hispanic and Latino. So shouldn't worry too much about those two terms, because we see that the majority actually identify with their nations of origin over pan-ethnic identity. So pan-ethnic identity would refer to people with descent from, let's say, Cuba and Dominican Republic and Mexico under the umbrella of Hispanic, where we see that the majority actually identify with those specific nations. So Cuban American, Mexican American, Dominican American. So nations of origin are really important to look at and to emphasize in terms of outreach to people. In fact, we see that vast majority see no common Hispanic culture. It's a super majority, actually. And it makes sense because people have their own countries, their own traditions that vary between them. So from an outsider's perspective, the could say the cultural traits or cultural traditions might look similar, but if it's something that you've grown up with, then it would look very different. Comparing US culture to that of Canada or to the UK, to someone from outside of the West, they might look very similar. But we know the differences between the US and Canada and Britain. So it's a similar idea. So next, we'll look into a bit more about the Hispanic population of Florida. We'll dive into that, look at nations of origin, we'll look at the growth of the population to see why it's so important to reach out to Hispanics in Florida for PTA, and also to get a bit more of a baseline for some outreach ideas. So we see that within Florida, the Latino share of the population, or the Hispanic share of the population, is about 1/4. And this is especially important because we see that the highest population growth has been within this demographic since 2010, where we see that actually the majority of the population growth, it's not even a plurality, but the majority has been among Hispanic Floridians. Looking at the specific statistics, we see that it's grown by about 1.4 million over the past 10 years, and it looks like it should continue over the next 10 years. But if we look within the state, we see differences in terms of the percentages in terms of the numbers of the Hispanic communities, where we see the highest percentages in Miami-Dade, in Hindley, as well as in Osceola County, and some of the lowest actual percentages in the Panhandle and in North Florida. But if we actually look at the total population in terms of numbers, we see that the highest numbers are within South and Southwest Florida, but also in Central Florida, so along the I-4 corridor. So Orange and Osceola and Polk and Hillsborough, Pinellas, as well as Duval. So there are Hispanic communities across the state. So it's not just in these areas with the highest concentration, the highest numbers, where we see that Pensacola, it's a significant, Fort Walton Beach and around the Tallahassee area, it's a significant percentage as well. So it's not a situation where Hispanic outreach should just be limited to South Florida and Duval. It's across the state, though the actual numbers will vary between communities. And here we have the top 10, where Miami-Dade has the highest in Latino or Hispanic share of the population. But we see that Broward and Orange are also high as well. But some areas that might get less attention include Brevard County in on the Sun Coast, as well as Polk, Lee County. So it's a statewide need to reach out to Hispanic communities. And looking at this, we see that Orlando especially has a fast-growing Hispanic population, especially in light of the past 2 hurricanes over the past 5 years, with the large population growth from Puerto Rico. And we can see that the Hispanic communities will vary in terms of their nations of origin or their locations of origin, where we can see that Orlando would be heavily from Puerto Rico. We would see that the plurality in South Florida, especially Miami-Dade, would be of a descent from Cuba. To a lesser extent, Tampa, but it's still there. So the specific nations will vary depending on your communities. And so it's very important to ask and to reach out. In particular, statewide, we see that the highest percentage of the plurality would be of Cuban descent, so about 28%. Next will be from Puerto Rico, 21, South American, 19, and that's one of the fastest growing demographics as well. Mexico, 14, and we see Dominican Republic and Central America with smaller numbers, but nonetheless still important and still growing numbers. So it's just important to note, so the vast majority of Hispanic Americans were born in the US. So vast majority identify fully as Americans. So they're born in the US, they have full citizenship. So it is an American community in large part that we're reaching out to. That may not have gotten as much attention as it's deserved in terms of PTA. And just some basic statistics, we see that the household income is pretty close to the overall average for Florida income. As well, in terms of the percentage of households where the adults would have bachelor's degrees, so it's about similar to the statewide average as well. So those all put things in context for us to then know how to put the experiences of Hispanic children in the state of Florida into full view, where we see that Florida children are more likely to be Hispanic, and we see that comparing children to adults and to seniors, that we have an ever-expanding share of children who are Hispanic compared to past generations. So that's why it's especially important to have a seat at the table for Hispanic people within the state for representation. And we see that the child poverty rate is actually below the national average, so that's a really good thing. but it nonetheless is still significant at above 20%. So next, the fun part, the part you've probably been looking forward to, the part that really was a magnet that drew you in. How can we reach out? What are some outreach strategies? So let's take a look at some ways to do this and ways to make people feel welcome and to get more people into the door to represent for PTA. So one interesting thing to step back and take a note of too would be to look at different cultural contexts or different ways of examining the world. One could be through this idea of the low context versus high context cultures. These are overall descriptions, so each individual is an individual. These ideas won't apply to everyone, but they're nonetheless still useful guides to understanding how different cultures would approach experiences in life. So first will be the low context culture. And this low doesn't mean bad, it just means low context. So this would be a type of culture that's more likely to use direct communication in terms of the messages that are being spoken. They are, you could say, very, if not short or abrupt, then be very precise and clear, and direct. So the reason why this type of communication style would be preferred in some countries, such as the US, such as Canada and the UK, Germany. The reason why these specific ways of communication will be preferred is that there's no expectation of common understanding or common experience. So there's a need to use words that are very literal and direct. These are societies that are more individualist, that focus on more individual actions, individual achievement. So what this means is that if there's some type of conflict between people or situations, that they are more likely to act in an uncompromising way, in a way that emphasizes dominance because of the it's a rejection of ambiguity or being unclear in a situation. This is in contrast with a high context culture, which we can include the cultures of Latin America as largely being under. So it emphasized cultures of Latin America because there are different cultures within Latin America. So can use that and say by extension, there are different cultures within the Hispanic communities within Florida. And these high context cultures are more likely to use and to consider indirect communication, including the language, the tone, the specific situation in which you have social interaction. So, and these communities are more likely to value close-knit relationships, more likely to be collectivist in terms of situating yourself in terms of your broader community and other people who are around, and more likely to use avoiding and obliging conflict styles. So even though you might see someone outwardly say that the situation is fine or agree with what someone said, it might not mean the situation is fine. It might not mean there's actual agreement about the situation. So that has to be at least considered in terms of reaching out to different communities. And just to visualize what we're talking about, and this can actually be useful, I'll show in the next slide how it can be directly useful to you in PTA. So this is a low context ad. So they're both for Coke. So this low context ad, we have two bottles of Coke, and we can see a bit of people's hands. And then we have the idea of sharing a Coke with a friend. We're just assuming that the two hands are two friends. So it's low context. We don't actually see their faces. We don't know where they are. We don't know what time of year it is or the situation. But if we compare that to the high context ad, we see two friends. We see people smiling. We see them holding the Cokes. We see what's potentially Chinese New Year in the background. So it's low context on the left, high context on the right. And if we apply that to ads, we see that we can have different, or flyers, we see that we can have a way of applying these ideas for outreach to events. contrasting the low context flyer here, which I mean, I like the flyer, so it's not a bad flyer at all. We have that there, and we don't in the Viva, so we don't have any faces. We don't have any specific situation there. But on the right, we have the high context flyer where we have people, we have the situation generally, we have them as a group. We also have the emotional connection with the people who are on the flyer. So this can be a useful way of having a perhaps a bicultural outreach strategy in terms of reaching people with respect to the low context versus high context ideas. We can do this as well with low context versus high context by having high context through making people feel welcome, by having beginnings of meetings with greetings in English and Spanish, not needing a translator or anything like that, but just knowing a couple of phrases, hola, bienvenidos, and just making it seem as if you are welcoming to a variety of different groups. I actually have used this strategy with my students who are majority Hispanic, and it's really been kind of an icebreaker and a way of welcoming students in. You notice that, and they fully speak English, and the majority are Hispanic American, but it's a good icebreaker, and it's a way to show that I respect your cultural origin, I respect your descent, and it seems to work, and they seem to really appreciate it. You can also do a skills inventory of volunteers, particularly to get translators. If you need translation of documents, translations of other materials, and don't just ask those who you know are of Hispanic descent. Ask a variety of people. You don't know who speaks what. You don't know who has experiences with the Hispanic community that you might not be aware of, or you don't know who is who actually identifies as Hispanic that you might not be aware of as well. So don't try not to use superficial or other ways of assessing people's identities, because you don't fully know until you ask. And some free language resources. I'm a big fan of Google Translate. I've actually been using that for the past 15 years. It's gotten a lot better in recent years, so that's pretty useful. And you can use that for documents. You can use it if you're having a conversation with someone. You can use the app, and it can transcribe what you're saying, and it can translate that. So that's very useful. We're living in the future, almost. So it's not a perfect tool yet. It's not going to be as good as using a person who's fluent in the language, but it's still going to be very useful, especially if you use phrases that aren't, could say, like idioms or specifically culturally relevant or culturally unique phrases. If you're very literal, then it can be very useful. I also include Memrise and Duolingo as some resources to learn some basic phrases in Spanish, but you can also use it for other languages as well. You don't have to become fluent. It's learning just a few phrases in a language can connect you to other people to a very wide extent, because it shows that you took the time to learn about their culture. And can also connect with local Hispanic serving organizations. So this is just a list of some, and I split it by region. So Miami has Hispanic Affairs Advisory Board, Latinos United, Orlando, Office of Multicultural Affairs. So many counties have offices similar to the Office of Multicultural Affairs. So I encourage you to reach out to those. Hispanic Leadership, also the Puerto Rican Action Initiative, so that can be useful. So there should always be resources available to you, including these formally organized resources. But on top of that, you can also connect with Hispanic faculty and staff. Kimberly, this one is especially important to you. Can you dive into it a bit?
Yes, it really is very important to me. I think it's important to connect with those faculty and staff members who are Hispanic because most of the time in schools, they're dealing with the Hispanic families more than anyone else, especially if there's a language barrier because, they can speak both languages or multiple languages or what have you. And those are the go-to people that the families seem to interact with. So by forming a relationship with those teachers or faculty members, I think it's really an advantage for us to have that connecting piece. So they can kind of be a liaison from us if we're PTA to the families because the families sometimes are worried or scared to come to meetings. They're afraid to be involved in things if they're not able to speak the language because they automatically assume they're going to be different. They're not going to be able to communicate. There's not going to be someone who can translate for them. And in most cases, they've come to rely on these faculty members who are speaking their language and who can communicate effectively to them to help them in all of their children's education and everything that's going on at school. So any information that they're getting, they're usually getting from these faculty members. And by us reaching out to those faculty members and letting them know, hey, we're going to have a meeting next week. Could you let all of these families that you're connected to know about this so that they know? And, even if they have to provide the information in Spanish, I think that there's a comfort level there where they're used to communicating with these faculty members. So they're going to at least get the information and they might be more than likely willing and excited to come to something like that if they're at least getting the information firsthand from somebody and not seeing it in English, trying to translate it, or just feeling like an outsider.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So it's always useful to connect with people who are part of your social circle, part of your school circle, and they most of the time, the vast majority of the time, are willing to help. So don't be afraid to ask.
Absolutely.
And also connect with Hispanic-focused student organizations, because many schools have Latinos in Action, Spanish Honor Society, Hispanic student unions, and language clubs that have students who are heavily involved in school and community activities. And you can connect with the parents through them by reaching out to these organizations. Just a quick note that although someone might identify as Hispanic and come from have origins in a predominantly Spanish-speaking country, they may not use Spanish as their predominant language at home if they aren't English speakers. We have other languages such as Guarani, Quechua, Nahuatl that exist and are very strongly used in Latin American countries. So, but never fear, technology is here. You can still use Google Translate for Guarani as well as Quechua. So that's still there. So even if you don't have someone accessible who is fluent, you can still communicate and reach out. So some general ideas for Hispanic Heritage Month events. So one could be hosting a Q&A panel for Hispanic student leaders. Can ask a variety of questions, not just about their experiences as being Hispanic, but just in general to get their own experiences as students within the school. You can host read-alongs of books with Hispanic authors, screen films with Hispanic screenwriters, directors, especially useful if they are from your communities. Hold informal field trips to go to locations that are especially important to the Hispanic communities in your area. You could host a meeting at a Hispanic-focused community agency or group within your area. But and these are, I think, very useful endeavors that you can have for Hispanic Heritage Month, Hispanic Heritage ideas. But I think overall it's better to focus on specific national identities, because recall the slide much earlier where the idea of a common Hispanic culture was rejected by the majority of people who identify as being Hispanic, as well the strong preference, the supermajority who identify with their nation of origin over the overall term Hispanic or Latino. So we see that the data is there that most people would identify with and prefer to be associated with their country of origin first. So a better idea could be to hold nationally specific events throughout the year. And some resources can include timeanddate.com, holidays calendar.com. You can look at different countries. So that could be an approach on top of Hispanic Heritage Month ideas. So just a quick recap. So Hispanic Americans can be of any race. The majority prefer Hispanic according to polling, but respect individual preferences. Different people have different preferences, so respect those and use those. And don't be afraid to ask. The majority are born in the US. In fact, the supermajority are born in the country. It would be good to focus on national heritage first because of people's identification with their nations of origin. Use high context cultural behavior when possible and when appropriate. As well, use free language resources. There are many, and they're expanding by the day. And always ask questions, listen. It's always useful to get people's perspectives and to respect people's preferences. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope that it's really useful, and I hope that it propels you in your PTA journey. Thank you very much. Gracias.